Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest. Hey there. Good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam. Before I introduce our special guest, just some housekeeping explanation for those of you who've never joined before. If you want to clap or you find something brilliant or funny, there are 3 emojis. You can just click on that and it'll capture that. If you need to make a comment or a question, just pose it in the lower right or your left hand corner. And if you want to send anyone a private message, just move your cursor over their name. Window will pop up and you can send them that. And if you're desperate to say something absolutely brilliant, there's a microphone next to your name and you can grab the mic and I'll invite you if you're not selling a used car. So today I'm really thrilled because we have Martin Palmer, who, some people want to take on really challenging things. And Martin has decided, the group that owns 1/7 of the Earth's mass, the faith community, we're going to convince them that they should invest all of their assets into sustainability and biodiversity. So, Martin, thank you so much for doing this, and I appreciate it. If you can unmute, there you go. Just for those in the audience that are not familiar with your work now and in the past, just give us a kind of a journey of who you are, what you have done, and what you're doing now. And thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Not at all, Robert. It's a delight. And I regularly quote you when talking about how you change the market by saying that fund managers and bank managers and the such like are herd animals. Turn the leading member of the herd and you turn the herd. I found that very helpful. It's as applicable to the religious world. Maybe we're more like sheep to keep in with the biblical imagery, but there we go. So I've worked with Robert for well over 20 years, off and on, and have always been hugely impressed by what he's aimed to do. And in a sense, it was meeting him that gave me the confidence that we could try and do something different. But let me take you back a little bit. So Martin Palmer, as you can probably guess, I'm English. And my most formative experience, I suppose, really, and delighted to see Isabel Hilton on today, and also Mason Tan, was when I was 18, my parents and I mutually agreed that about 6,000 miles between us would be a very, very good idea. And so I went and volunteered through the church. I am a Christian. Volunteered through my church, the Anglican Church, to go and work in Hong Kong in a children's home, knowing absolutely nothing about China. I mean, this was 1972. When I was at school, we never studied China in history, geography, or RE, or anything else. It was quite extraordinary. So I went to Hong Kong, ended up in the New Territories, where nobody really spoke English in the children's home. So I learned to speak Cantonese, which used to be very useful for getting kind of, 10% off meals in chippies in England, but not much use if you're trying to talk to Xi Jinping, which I have had to try and do on one occasion. That's a whole other story. But I also learned to read classical Chinese at the time because we sang hymns every night, and the hymn book had the first line of the hymn in English at the top. And so gradually I worked out what the characters meant and then went on to Cambridge to study theology, religious studies, and classical Chinese. And I have the great joy of one of the things that I find most relaxing is I translate classical Chinese texts, mostly Buddhist, Christian, Taoist, some Confucianist, and now the historic novels of China for Penguin. So I've always had that exposure into a completely different world, and a world that if you're able to read the characters and go inside the classic texts, you begin to understand the mindset, the psychology. And I suppose I brought that to my work. I then went on after Cambridge to found what turned out to be the first ever multi-faith education centre in the UK, in inner city Manchester, where it was very physical. We took children out into Chinatown in China to look at the way in which in Chinatown they had completely changed the orientation of the buildings, or lowered them, or even got rid of them in some cases, in order that the feng shui, the spirit, the sense that the land was alive, could speak through it. I took them up into the Jewish area and helped, in fact, create what has recently been described as the most important tourist site in Britain, which is the Jewish Museum in Manchester. A fantastic place. If you've never been, go. Did the same with the with the Muslim areas, to go and look at what physical impact people with beliefs had on their environment. And this attracted a lot of attention, a lot of interest. And it was in 1982 that I was asked if I would write the first ever book for religious education, which in Britain, as you may know, is a compulsory subject. First book ever on religions and environment. And I think what dear old WWF wanted us to do was to sort of basically say, well, all the religions really agree, and they all basically agree with WWF. So do sponsor WWF. And unfortunately, we didn't do that. In fact, we called the book Worlds of Difference, because what we wanted to explore was that the reason why different faith communities care for the planet differs hugely depending upon their beliefs. So within the Judeo-Christian tradition, is because we have this notion of a sense of responsibility. This is our planet. God has given us a responsibility here. Please don't talk to me about stewards. It's not the phrase that I favor. It's stewards manage things. They don't have a relationship with them. I prefer to talk of a sacramental relationship with nature within the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Islamic tradition, similar roots, has a completely different reason for caring about this earth, because this is not our planet. The fall was from another planet. And if we work well enough and prove our ability to behave responsibly, we go home. We go back to our original planet. And then if I talk to Taoists, a completely different perspective, which is that our role as on the planet is to balance two vast natural forces, yin and yang, which are not good or bad forces. They just are. And our role is to keep the balance. Our role is to be the kind of, okay, woo, it's a bit too much that side. Let's do this side. And a wonderful moment when I took the head of climate change to China in 2008 to a meeting of the Taoists, and he was explaining climate change, and all these 1,000+ monks and nuns were looking slightly bewildered, and this wonderful old master Fan, amazing man in his 80s, stood up and he said, this is very simple. Basically, fossil fuels are yin, they are earth. And when we burn them, they become yang, they become heavenly, they become air, but they're not supposed to be there. And by not being there, they're disturbing the whole balance. So our job is to stop burning this and then to restore the balance. And all the Taoists were kind of going, oh yeah, got it now. And actually, so did the chap from the UN, who used it ever afterwards as an example of how to actually explain in a different way the stuff that we've now had. We're heading for our 28th conference on this, when we knew the answer in Kyoto. Anyway, that's another story. So I did that program, and the book was a huge success. First book actually that had ever been written of any type for the different faiths in the environment. And we looked at Chinese tradition, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Jewish. We also looked at humanism. That's a lovely belief system, lovely beliefs, narratives, as well as the Yanomamo of the Amazon and Australian Aboriginal. And this was quite a breaker of new worlds for most people. They'd never thought about a link. And then Prince Philip who was then the international president of WWF, read the book. And I worked with him as his religious advisor on the environment for 37 years, till the day he died. And I always said that, because I'd written it for 11-year-olds and it had lots of pictures, he not only read it, he understood it. And so he said, this is amazing. I had no idea about all the faiths and this attitude. Why don't we have a meeting of the faith for our 25th anniversary? And he went off to WWF's headquarters in Switzerland. And they said, we've got our plans for the 25th anniversary celebration. It's going to be on economics, it's going to be in Jakarta. We've booked the hotels, we've got speakers. And Prince Philip, who was never bashful in coming forward, said, well, I'm not coming. And the board went, well, what do you mean? You're our president. You've got to come. He said, no. Look, if it was data that was going to save the planet, we would be saving it now. We have the data. This was 1985. Trouble is, we're not touching anybody's hearts and minds. And he said there are only two things that have ever done that effectively, the arts and religion. And for much of history, they've been the same thing. Just read this book by this chap called Palmer, all about the religions. Why don't we bring the major religions together with all the major environmental groups and see what we can do together? Total panic around this table of kind of post-Christian, post-sort of pseudo-scientific WWF types, who mostly did English at university. And they were sort of saying, but where would we go? And he said, well, Assisi, of course, St. Francis. Somebody chimed up, isn't that frightfully Christian, your Royal Highness? To which, God bless his cotton socks, Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan of the Ismaili tradition of Islam said, I haven't been to Assisi for years. No, the Muslims will come. And thus it is, ladies and gentlemen, that big events are brought to birth, primarily through ignorance. But there we are. It's the best way sometimes. So I then was asked to arrange this event. It was the first such event. It was the biggest media event WWF have ever had. 86 national television stations broadcast the grand ceremony and rituals we held inside the Basilica in Assisi. And each of the five faiths, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, issued a key statement. Where does our faith sit with regards to care for the environment? Why do we care? What's it about? Each of them distinctive. And that gave us the basis then of going back to them and saying it can only be 2,000 words long. Really important thing of working with religions, limit how much time they have. So 2,000 words. And it meant we could go back and say, very interesting, what you say on page 2 about X, Y, and Z, would that mean, for example, you'd be interested in working on forest protection or on marine protection or on ethical lifestyles and so forth? When we started this program in 1986, I'd gone around the world at Prince Philip's request, and we discovered that there were 3 specifically faith environment programs running. One Buddhist one, based out of Hong Kong, working with Thai children in schools in Thailand and with Tibetan refugees in North India. A second one, which was in Portugal, which was Christian, and actually it was a bunch of evangelicals who'd gone to convert the Catholics in Portugal. It didn't work, but they did discover that the land they'd got their premises on was a major migration path, so they set up Arosha, name of the place. And this is now one of the biggest Christian groups. And then our program on multi-faith education in the UK. That was it. That was it. Nobody had really made that connection before. By 1995, Prince Philip was given an award by UNEP, one of the 500 Environmental Leaders Awards, on the basis that they calculated we'd now reached 150,000 religious environmental programs. And when we closed, and then he and I set up a new organization called Alliance of Religions Conservation. We, by that stage, were now working not just with the 5 I mentioned, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, but also with Baha'i, Jains, Zoroastrians, Sikh, Shinto, and Taoists. So by the time we closed ARC in 2019, we had succeeded in what we aimed to do, which was to get every major religious organization, network, tradition, so like the Anglican Church or Sri Lankan Buddhists or Sunni Shia Muslims in say, Iran, to come out with statements on the environment and to begin to do programs. And we'd also got most of the secular bodies, UN, World Bank, others, TBLI even, to consider working with the faiths as partners. And the UN now calculates we're at about 1.5 million religious environmental projects. And when people like Robert says to me, how did you do that with a staff of 10? The point is, our capacity has always been the faiths themselves. Our role is to awaken within the faith something that is latent, that needs an external source. I've always run secular organization, ARC, the Alliance of Religions Conservation, secular. FaithInvest, the group I now head, secular. But with a deep understanding, a deep knowledge of faith. So that's kind of my background. I've kind of done this a bit before, slight sense of deja vu. But one of the things that happened in the life of ARC was that we were asked by EarthScan and the University of California to do an audit of the faiths. Now, nobody had ever done an audit of the faiths before. You have groups like the Pew Foundation who do research, and they estimate that about 80 to 85% of the population claim to be members of a major faith. But nobody had actually said to them, well, what do you own? What do you run? How much of it? What do you do with it? So we set out to do an audit, and we discovered, and these are guesstimates. I would hasten to say this, but we guesstimate that the faiths are still involved with around 50% of all schools worldwide. They actually own a third of all universities. So a simple example, Japan, one of the most secular countries in the world, has 52 religious universities: Confucianist, Buddhist, Shinto, Catholic, and Christian. I rather like that. In Asia, because of the different characters that were developed by the missionaries, the Catholic missionaries and then the Protestant missionaries for the word God, because they are very different from each other, as far as the Chinese and most of Asia is concerned, this is two different religions. Now, as an Anglican, I kind of sympathize with that, but there we are. So we have that. We found that in well over a third of all medical facilities owned by the faiths or managed by them in some capacity. About 9% of the habitable surface of the planet owned, and that includes a major share in commercial forests, a major share in urban developments, and a major share in agriculture, in production of agriculture. And then we asked the naughty question, well, how much have you got invested? And in most cases, they were unable to give us an answer. Now, this is when I first bumped into Robert, which you can't really help doing if you actually walk near him. But anyway, we began to appreciate that this was sort of kind of slightly taboo. Now, there are organizations, and we have Seamus on the call here, like ICCR, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility in the States, who for years, 50 years now, have been taking the faith's role as stakeholders seriously and had mobilized the faiths on that. Huge program with some extraordinary characters in it. But still, it was quite difficult to get information on what the faiths actually owned. So we did some research work. We got funding from various very shady organizations like Citigroup and HSBC. We had very long spoons. We supped with very long spoons. But what came out of that study was a realization that probably the faiths represent the fifth largest investing group. And I mean, figures. A rough figure that we got, excuse me, from work with HSBC is that about 14% of the total capital market is owned by faiths. What is also interesting is that if you then look at the proportion of investors who are active religiously in comparison to the norm for their own country, investors are more religiously active as a group than the average group in that country. And why? Because in almost all our faiths, we are taught to think about money as something we have a responsibility for. Future generations, we have a future responsibility for. Money should be used wisely and thoughtfully, not squandered, and so on and so forth. And so the other factor in this calculation is that around 30% of investors are religious, are in some form or another actively religious. Now, increasingly, that will be that they're much more spiritual, They may be doing yoga, they may be going on Buddhist retreats, they may go on the Camino pilgrimage to the Shrine of Santiago de Compostela for all sorts of reasons. But for them, that dimension of life is hugely important. Just as a sidebar on that, the Danish government just issued 2 days ago a report on the fact that 75 to 80% of people in hospitals in Denmark, which is one of the most secular countries, want to have access to spiritual guidance, help, resources when they are in hospital. So this assumption that religion has kind of died a death, well, some of the institutional forms are struggling, and many people do not feel comfortable owning the language of a particular faith. But the quest for meaning and spirituality, a sense of something far greater, far more important, being part of a greater story, that is still very, very central. So when Prince Philip and I created the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, we had seen so many organizations, particularly NGOs, coming into being for very good reasons and then continuing to be in order to continue to be. So he and I had agreed that there would be a terminus ad quem. We would go for 20 years, and if we had succeeded, then we would shut, and if we hadn't succeeded, we should shut, because obviously we were crap. We succeeded. We went on a couple of years extra. But when we came to close ARC, he sat down with me and he said, look, we've got all the statements. This is great. Every major religious tradition has now said where it stands on environment, on many of them on energy, fossil fuels, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the faiths are the largest group that has done disinvestment from fossil fuels. Sorry about the cough. But he said statements are fine. Why are they ignoring the fact that they are stakeholders? And that's why FaithInvest exists, because we're trying to answer that question. Why is it that an enormous amount of the work that goes on in the faiths on the environment is kind of trying to be gadflies to the system? Whereas if, in fact, 80% of the world's population belong to a major religion, the faiths are actually part of the problem. But if we are also the fifth largest investing group with, $14 trillion institutionally invested, plus all the educational elements, plus the fact that in most societies we contribute something like 7% of the total GDP in voluntary service to civil society, therefore civil society would collapse without us. Why in God's name do we think we're not part of the system? And if we are part of the system, why has it taken us so long to recognize how broken that system is? Why is it? Well, the answer is very straightforward. To my astonishment, when we set up FaithInvest, which was after a big event, well, very interesting moment. So we had a meeting with the UN at the beginning, literally January 2015, when they were finalizing the SDGs. And they suddenly went, oh, we have forgotten to consult the faiths. They consulted everybody else, but they've forgotten the faiths. So they asked us to organize an event. And again, rather like WWF, hoping that the faiths would just sort of say, yes, support WWF. I think they thought the faiths would go, yeah, support the SDGs. Actually, they didn't. They critiqued them very severely, particularly from a Muslim and from a Christian and from a Hindu perspective. They said, why are you just patching up consumerist capitalism? Why are you not doing anything seriously radical? Why is your notion of poverty only $2 a day rather than poverty of relationships, poverty of family, poverty of community facilities and abilities? Why is it so limited in your thinking? So that was a bit of a shock to the UN. There were a lot of other points at which the faith went, yeah, gender, okay, we hold our hands up on that one. But what we then produced a series of commitments from the faith as to where they would be particularly wanting to help and work on SDGs, which were many of them. But the UN then noticed that a third of all the groups said, we are very interested in this whole move of the SDGs to bring business into investing in solutions. And we want to look at our investments and see whether we can do something. UN was very excited, wrote to us and said, do they have any money? So we were able to say yes, quite a bit actually. And we were asked to produce for UNDP and OECD a white paper on faiths and investment. And we did. And out of that then came a meeting which Robert brokered for us between the honest burghers of Zug in Switzerland, who felt, as good Catholics, that they had a little bit of reparation to do for the fact that they don't actually charge an income tax because they make so much money off the companies that nobody else would actually give house room to. But that's another story, and they are on a path of redemption, I'm happy to tell you. But they provided us with wonderful facilities, and the Jesuits have their center for Jesuit work on entrepreneurship and Zen Buddhism just outside Zug. So we held our event there. And at that, we had over 60 major faith investment groups. Out of that came a movement to create a new organization to help further the work. And that's what led to Faith Invest. Now, I began work on this originally in 2001. And with the help of people like Seamus, we set up the 3IG, the International Interfaith Investment Group. Our problem was we were about 15 years too early. We had assumed that most groups, faith groups, had negative screening. No, I would say less than 20% at that point did. We also assumed that they would be wanting to think about where they could put their money. No, you had outstanding groups like Seamus's that were doing that, but most were not. In fact, the vast majority were not. And so we kind of withdrew. 3IG existed for a while, did some very good research work indeed, but we came back in at the request of the UN to actually bring in this whole SDG investment dimension to the faiths as a faithful challenge. To come to the Zug meeting, we asked that each group do a deep dive. We asked them to go back to their core beliefs. What are those? From those core beliefs, what are the core values that emerge? What are those? How are you applying those core values to what you do with your finance? What do you need to do more in order to actually apply your core values and beliefs to your investments? And those became what are called the Zug guidelines, and you'll find those on the Faith Invest website. And out of that, then we created Faith Invest and came into being in late 2019. And essentially, we've continued that process. We help faiths to go back to why they exist and why people gave them money and resources in the first place. And we help them look at the values that should now be shaping their investment. But bear in mind that most faith investments, small and medium particularly, do not have professional staff. Or if they do, they'll have one person. There's one big fund in Ireland that has a lovely lady who was a missionary in Zambia who comes in every Thursday afternoon. Well, she's not going to have time to go and do due diligence on whether she should be looking at funds that Mark Campanale has highlighted in Carbon Tracker. She probably knows Mark because he's a good Catholic, but she wouldn't, So there was this break that had arisen whereby most faiths had outhoused their finances to groups that were very, very happy to do the money for them, so long as they weren't asked to do anything. And I do remember, Robert, you when we launched 3IG saying, to claim that faiths, that as a faith group who don't have a screen, is ridiculous because you don't tend to invest in pornography. You're not into heroin addiction and drug smuggling. You're not into child labor. So you've already got screens. So what's your problem with increasing those and doing more? Our approach is very much, we know what you're against. Faiths are very good at being against things. So it's kind of one of our specialities, really. We ask, what are you for? And when they go, I think we want to be nice to the planet and to people and things like that. We go, great. So why? So a lot of what Faith Invest does, and I have a fantastic team. I know absolutely nothing about investments, even less than I know about technology. And we've got Pippa on the call, and she will affirm to all of that. But I have an amazing team that understand this. And we've seen this wonderful process in the team itself, where those coming in from the investment side took them a little while to realize quite how damaged the system already is. Whereas others coming in more from the faith charity side were kind of going, what do you mean damaged? The thing's broken. And we've arrived at a sort of modus vivendi where we help the faiths, and we have many of them coming to us. We have over 200 coming through the Laudate Si Investment Hub, for example. We help them to go deep. What is it you believe? What are the values? How are you applying those values? What does it mean in terms of negative screening? So having done that, where will you put your funds now to make the kind of world you want. And this, obviously, for the Catholics, this goes back to Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical in 2015. But what that has done has triggered in many faiths a kind of question, oh, right, well, what's our sort of version of Laudato Si? Where's our core beliefs? We're working very closely with the Muslim world, particularly through UNDP and Faith for the Earth, who have created the most comprehensive and agreed statement on the environment and on development that has ever been produced. Al-Mizan, it'll be launched later this year. So with the Muslim Union of Indonesia, who deal with $1 trillion worth of zakat per year through their 17 banks and investment and insurance companies, we're looking at creating an Al-Mizan Investors Hub. In the same way that we've done for the Catholics with the Laudato Si Investment Hub, we're looking at a similar thing with the Taoists of China, excuse me, to produce an ESG SDG investment hub for lay Taoists. There are a lot of very wealthy Taoists now. Same program is beginning to emerge. Something I never expected to do, Robert, and maybe it's something that you and I ought to think about as we grow older, is I've helped create the first ever Buddhist monastic pension fund. Because in the past, Buddhist monks just died, in the harness or with the alms bowl. Now, with better health, they're getting very old and frail and fragile and dementia and so on and so forth. So they need care, they need looking after. Plus, you had a lot of Westerners who converted to Tibetan or Thai Buddhism, Sri Lankan Buddhism, and they kind of, expect a care home. They don't expect to be still going out in the streets begging. Thank you very much indeed. So we've helped create the first ever Buddhist pension fund. Out of that has now flowed an invitation from the Hong Kong Buddhist Center to explore with Buddhist organizations in Asia the creation of a Buddhist investors hub, primarily again for lay Buddhists, because monks and nuns are not traditionally allowed to handle money at all. So what we do is we know enough about pretty much every faith in the world, every faith group, to go in and ask relatively intelligent questions. And once you do that, people love to tell you what they believe. They love to tell you what makes them passionate about what they do. And when you get that, and you can then also point to the fact that they've already made statements about environment, about sustainability, about climate, about biodiversity, then you've got a bedrock of which to say, well, look, you've already got these commitments. How are those actually reflected in your investments? And I was saying to Robert earlier today, it's working. It's working because, in a sense, we are empowering the faith groups to take back ownership, intellectual ownership, spiritual ownership of their assets. It's still out mostly with fund managers, though we're working on a whole program to set up a database of fund managers who actually understand faiths. We're getting quite a lot of the very big fund managers saying, oh, come and train us about faith. We have my dear beloved friend Mason Tan on this call, and I'm going to embarrass him once again, as I did last week at a big meeting. Mason, a few years ago, came up with a brilliant statement, and he's a devout Christian, a fund manager, active on social issues. And he said, I have faith, and I spell it R-I-S-K. Now, last week, and I'll finish with this and then open it up for questions. Last week, we held a unique meeting. This was some of the major religious development agencies in the world, mostly Christian, Catholic Christian, Muslim. We had Hindu presence as well. We had huge interest from one of the biggest Taoist development agencies based out of Hong Kong. This was the first time that any group had brought together the heads of the major people within religious development agencies to say, why do you only do grants? The religious development agencies of the world distribute per annum $6 billion. Most of that disappears. Most of it goes into grants for 3 years. And then if you go back 2 years later, there's a rather weather-beaten sign which says, this was funded by Christian Aid. And you look around for what's going on, and there's not much there. So when we started talking about what we've raised with this entire network, and to our joy, about 75% of them are saying they want to go the next step. We said, why don't you put aside 5%, just 5% a year of your 6 billion as an investment fund per year, build it up, and actually begin to look for investment opportunities to deal with poverty, to deal with hunger, to deal with devastation, to deal with refugees. And I think it was yesterday, a new fund was launched in the UK for opportunities for refugees, to create funding opportunities, entrepreneurship projects for refugees. We have 4 groups that are already listed that as a priority they wanted to engage in. So we're delighted. But so you have this whole question now to the religious development world, and their initial reaction was, oh, well, investments, I mean, there's a big risk factor, isn't there, and so on. And this was kind of coming up again and again. And then a group of people began to say, well, hang on, you mean there are no risks in grants? You mean there's no risk in developing an aid culture? There's no risks in white foreigners coming in and doing good and telling people, and I've run charities for 50 years. What I know about grants from philanthropists is it's a form of servitude. You're kept at the level at which they find you. They might increase it a little bit. They might give another appointment for somebody to, I don't know, relate to international agencies concerned with X, Y, and Z, and then the grant goes after 3 years. And I remember an Ethiopian friend of mine saying, please don't give us lots of money because you destroy the structure we already have. It expands, and then you go and it collapses, and we don't go back to where we were before. We go back to nothing. So we're looking at the faith development worlds as another investment area. So it's all very exciting. What we need are projects to invest in. We are creating so much demand that we're having problems finding things for people to invest in. So we'd love to know possibilities, but I've talked way too long, and Robert's been very patient. And he has been waving his hands around every so often, cutting something like this. So I'm going to stop, and I would love to hear what you think, as well as any questions.
Thank you, Martin. It's always such a challenge because you're so shy and not willing to say anything. I have to pull all the words out of you. So thank you. I had one particular question. The faiths have a lot of assets, either in cash, land, buildings. In some cities in Europe, most of downtown is owned by the faiths, but they also own a lot of land and forest and that. And biodiversity, unfortunately, is not really being embraced by the large institutional investors. I mean, they're talking about it in research, but not really allocating money. And wouldn't Red Plus or carbon credits and reforestation and avoiding deforestation, which ties into livelihood for smallholder farmers and water, and wouldn't that be a place for the face to? It would be not a big leap for them because they already own land like that.
It's not a big leap, and a lot is already happening. So, for example, for over 40 years in this country, the 16,000 churchyards of the Church of England, which are mini ecosystems, you don't tend to go and spray where you just bury granny. You don't build, a factory on top of grandpa.
Right.
So very often you've got unique ecosystems, and we've now got about 7,000 churchyards that are now calling themselves wilding churchyards, very much create that. On a much bigger scale, we're bringing the faiths very much into the program being launched by the EAT Foundation and Lancet, which will be launched in the COP in November, which is around sustainable agriculture. And we've done a lot of work with faith-owned land, for example, in East Africa, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, where we've been able to help bring in adaptation and good crop management, and in fact increase productivity by linking them in either to the Quran or to the Bible, so that farmers are very traditional. You know, if the UN turns up and says do this, they're probably going to say, yeah, you said completely the reverse 5 years ago. So we work with a whole cadre of faith people who are involved in agriculture, and that's taking off a very big scale. We've been working particularly with people like Jamie Irvin at UNDP's Nature-Based Solutions on the forest owning. So a big campaign that we did under ARC back in 2000, started in 1999 and went on really till 2010, was to get faith-owned forests in FSC, Forest Stewardship Council. And for example, a very good example would be something like 20 to 25% of all commercial forests in Scandinavia are owned by the church. And 85% of those are now FSC managed and with a very strong biodiversity side. In the States, a remarkable woman called Molly Burnham is doing a project for the Catholic Church on actually tracking all the land it owns, because it really has no idea what it owns. So she's doing an enormous project and then looking at them in terms of what are they suitable for in terms of forestry or agriculture or agroforestry or recreation or conservation projects, etc. So there is a big exploration of the use of land. And then there is the thing of food. The faiths, we estimate, serve about 500 million meals a day around the world through their charity, through their schools, through their hospitals, through their welfare, etc. So as a purchasing group, the faiths could actually be almost single-handedly funding the rise of organic, local, fair trade, etc. food production, which is what we've done with things like the Methodists Hotel and the Quakers in London. On property, just very briefly on that, because this is really interesting. As we know, the major religious orders are dying, diminishing rapidly. So are many of the old religious structures like churches, missions, chapels, even nowadays mosques and temples. What do you do with them? Well, the habit has been, particularly for the religious orders where they've got nuns or monks to support into old age, is you sell it. Now, by the time a religious order retreats and leaves an old church and a monastic building or a parish hall, it's crap. You know, they haven't repainted it for 20 years because they knew they weren't going to keep it. The electricities were repaired by somebody who said he knew what he was doing. And if you turn on the lights and the cooker at the same time, the entire system blows. Most of the woodwork has rotted. So what you actually get for it is a pittance. We are working very closely with a fascinating group in Canada called Trinity Capital. And their program is, they say to a church, don't give up the site, invest the building as your contribution into entrepreneurship and the creation of community centers, healthcare, educational programs. Invest it. Take a return when it begins to make a profit, because it will have a commercial dimension. Offer the land, offer the building, and then bring in other stakeholders to make that possible. And that's beginning to catch on. So we're seeing the buildings being seen not as a burden, but as actually how you continue to have a presence. Where I grew up on the outskirts of Bristol on a big housing estate, the church is virtually closed. I mean, it's a wreck. We're working with them. This is the third poorest estate in Britain. So what it needs are opportunities. It needs places for training young people in skills that they don't have. It needs a place where the local supermarket that gets broken into or vandalized on a weekly basis can actually bring people who are fraught and have a place where they can sit them down and talk through what their needs are, etc. Sort of social care dimension. So there's a lot happening that goes under the radar, but gives me more hope than it gives me anxiety.
I remember when we did a session in Paris years ago, and there was one or two sessions that your organization were hosting and moderating, and I was surprised when I look at the photos. It was packed. I mean, those sessions were packed. I thought that all of these financial alpha males were interested in religion. And then I realized, no, they just want access to the asset owners who are the faith community, because if they go to Japan and they call up the Shintos, hey, I'm coming through, can we have a meeting? They're not going to get anywhere.
Oh, Rob, you cynic.
Well, that's okay.
No, I mean, and we now have to be very careful.
Yeah.
I coined the word at the Glasgow COP, faith wash.
Yeah.
Because, seriously, I mean, I would put the World Economic Forum into that. They've had a faith wash program for decades.
Yeah.
Where they kind of wheel out tame religious leaders who wouldn't say boo to a corrupt system, really.
Right.
Or they would, but they would certainly not say that the system itself is faltering. And they kind of give it a blessing and off they go. And we find this increasingly. A couple of very big groups have come to us and said, we'd love to be sponsoring you, and we'd love to sort of be trained in how to work with faiths. And we have to just think, well, wait a minute. Are these groups actually able to offer what our members, or not so much members, but the people we're working with do? So in a sense, we're trying to create a new cadre of investment managers who are religiously sensitive. So, and it's not quite as much of a search for a needle in a haystack as your smile seems to indicate, Mr. Rubinstein.
Well, I think it's harder to find that than to convince the faiths to integrate sustainability, because the financial sector, they're hunters. Some are pirates, but
Yes.
in general, they're incentivized for short-term behavior and get their bonuses and their carries.
Absolutely. And that's another area where the faiths differ. The average faith investment is 25 years.
Mm.
The average. My favorite one of all is the Parsis of Mumbai, who did an investment program back in 1815, which they're still capitalizing and getting the returns from now, which was it's an extraordinary story, and I haven't got time to go into it if you're here. I think one of the things that we're looking for, to be honest, Robert, we've come up with this phrase, faith consistent investing.
Mm.
It's very simple. Given your faith, given your investments, how consistent are you in the relationship between them? Mm. We are beginning to see new groups coming into being that want to work with that. Yes, they're hunters, but they're hunters who very often have come into this because of dissatisfaction with the system that exists. So Tribe, for example, is one group I would give, who broke away. The three founders broke away from highly profitable jobs and a certain security. I would also point to people like, oh God heavens, I've forgotten his name. The head of Hermes, a Muslim, deep philosophical Muslim. Yes, who, when I met him for the first time, we were trying to get sponsorship out of him for the Zug event. And his chief of staff said, yes, he's got 10 minutes. You can talk to him there. Then I discovered that he'd done his PhD on whether the Pope's banner given to the conquistadors in Spain in 1053, not 1063, was actually a crusade banner. And I was able to point out to him that the same banner had been given to the Normans when they invaded the Anglo-Saxons in 1066. So as you can imagine, we talked for about an hour and a half until the poor chap in charge said, well, are we going to fund them or not? And he went, yes, of course. Now,
that was Sakhr Nasralbey.
Sakhr Nasralbey, that's it. Wonderful man. So there are people in the system, there are people on the edge of the system, there are people out of the system, and we are finding that people find them quite attractive. So anyway, enough from me. What about other?
Before I take a couple of questions, what can the audience that's watching this now and the ones that will watch a replay, what can they do to help you? Because you're not a fund manager, so you're not sitting on a pile of cash. So everybody, hey, Martin, give me a check because I've got the solution to climate change. So what can the audience do to specifically help you? You're trying to be an honest broker and guiding the faiths toward faith-consistent investing and showing them what they can do with their assets. So what do you need?
What we need are we need introductions to religious organizations that have funds, and we've got a lot, more than we can manage. We've been doing a lot of one-on-ones. We're now preparing a whole training program that will help faiths do that deep dive. And then we come in at sort of the crucial points, and we're expanding our staff to do that. We are also looking for groups that are able to offer a sound ethical program that can show that they have a consistent history of ethical investment, that would then be that might be of interest to our clients, to our not members. We don't have members, Robert, but the people we're working with. We don't ask for membership. We're not a sect. Third thing is products. We need sensible, serious products that address issues around biodiversity, around climate, around sustainability, around gender, around equality. We've actually just in the process of establishing a multi-faith just transition fund, which will cluster together many of the religious funds that are coming into existence as a result, in part from our work, so that funds that maybe have, 50 million coming in from the Lutheran World Federation, don't have to reinvent everything for what is a relatively small fund, but can join up with the Methodists of the UK, who've got 10 million, or the Church of England that's just given 100 million for reparation for slavery, which is, well, don't get me even started on that as an Anglican. So we are looking to create clusters of investors that want to address specific issues. So we want solutions that address those issues. And that would be things like refugees. That would be about youth and enablement. And that's our program that's emerging with the YMCA. That would be programs around, programs around issues such as climate or biodiversity or forestry or agro forestry, etc. So we need solutions. We need things that faiths can invest in, because our greatest fear is we create a demand and there's nothing there particularly to go into or people to guide that journey. And then the final thing is, my guess is, and knowing a few of the people on this call, that quite a lot of you are involved with your own faith groups. Well, ask them where their money is, because we work kind of from the middle downwards. We've already got the top leadership, the Pope with the Laudato Si, the head of the Taoists with their statement on the environment, the major Hindu leaders. We've got the top. We come in at the middle with the people who actually manage the money. We need the demand from below. Okay. So that when a church group or a Muslim group, a Jewish group, or whatever it is, has their annual meeting, someone says, I'd just like to ask, where is our money going? Whether that's at your parish level, your local level, your regional level, your national level, or international. Ask the question, because then you can say, and if you want to know how to perhaps explore this, get in touch with FaithInvest.
Okay, I have a question from Jacob. I think he's the only Mormon on this this call. Jacob was saying, it seems that the faiths have a complicated relationship with money. Mm. They have way more than they want people to know that they have. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recently fined $1 million by the SEC for obscuring profits in shell companies. Have you found faiths are resistant to the transparency requirements that comes with investing versus grants and charity?
Yes. Jacob, I mean, very interesting. If you're coming from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was invited to Salt Lake City by a group of Mormon environmental activists, and one of the former professors, one of the leading professors of Mormon church history, Bob Reese, to explore helping them set up a much bigger environmental program, including looking at the fact that the church had just admitted it had over $100 billion invested.
Sure. And
we have some tentative feelers out into a church that is beginning to realize that it is going to be looked at much more critically, and its own people are asking much more fundamental questions. So sometimes scandal is very good. It's the only thing that ever moves the Church of England. Absolutely, that's a given. I think, but the historic issue is in a sense a feeling that the spiritual world should not rely upon the material world. I mean, it's almost as simplistic as that. If this is good, why does it have to rely on investments? Well, because the Catholic Church is the largest single organization in the world. I mean, it's not very organized, but, there are 1.2 billion of them. So it's this tension. And, you've got unhelpful things like Jesus saying, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's, which is kind of sort of setting up a schism. That there's that side which is unclean in a sense. This is what we have to deal with. But this is where the real wisdom comes. And I suppose that's why when religious organizations run out of steam in an area with a building, they get rid of it. Because it's kind of like this is where a sort of Manichaean fear of the physical comes in. It's a kind of physical hold that they're obligated to. And we try and turn that around by saying, no, this is a blessing you can still give to that community. So it is very difficult. And in Buddhism, it's even more extreme. Buddhist monks and nuns can't even handle money. Try saying to a Buddhist monk, we'll just take the nearest taxi and we'll meet you at the other end. Well, as long as you've got some cash, you'll get out the taxi. But otherwise, you'll be sitting there probably expounding on the Lotus Sutra, which is nice, but isn't going to pay the bill. So yes, there is. But I have to tell you one story, which I know Isabel will enjoy, and Mason. I helped the Taoists develop the first eco pilgrimage town, a place called Loguan, which holds one of the great temples of Taoism, Loguan Dao, where, according to legend, Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching, one of the great texts. And it was a huge redevelopment that went on there. It's incredible. The food is all organic and it's all, it's just, you've got greenhouses that are, 18 stories high. I mean, it's the kind of thing the Chinese do. But part of this was that they built a new temple to the three gods of good fortune, many children living long, which are the three kind of principles of folk religion. Beautiful temple with quotes from the various Buddhist texts down the footpath and down the paths, all about environment and nature and care. And on the slip road, the signpost of the slip road in Chinese says, this is the temple of good fortune. In English, it says the temple of Mammon. And that's our problem. We wrestle within the religions with a sense that this physical world is almost under a separate domain, and that our job is to rescue people from it, not necessarily to be deeply embedded in it. And yet, that's always where the faiths have actually been visibly active. Education, welfare, you name it.
You provide, because of the access to the asset owner community, and through all the different faiths, you're in a very strong position, but you don't have 5,000 employees to manage this Herculean task. And there are people who have solutions. There are people who are not looking for money. They just have projects that they would like to work with the faiths because they're community-based or things like that. What is the most efficient way for those that are watching this saying, I want to get involved and support, or I'm looking for support from you? What's the most efficient way? Because I don't want people overwhelm you and you have 1,000 emails and everybody is selling you, well, we're setting up a new restaurant over here. Can we get a check?
We have quite a rigorous screening process, which is the delete button on emails. No, I mean, in seriousness, we get a lot of stuff, of which I would say 10% is worthwhile. But I have a wonderful team that when I get it, I pass it to them, and then they come back and say whether we should pick it up or not. We are only as good as the networks that we have. We're only as good as the expertise that we can get access to, because people share, from all sorts of reasons, and not just mercenary, a sense that this is important. And I think in the end, talk to us. Let us know what you're thinking if you feel this is good and worthwhile. And as I say, we are looking for people who will partner with us, people who will come up with programs that we can direct, we can point attention to. I love Jacob's point about storytelling. I'm a storyteller. When my children used to say, "Dad, what exactly do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm a storyteller and I'm a religious diplomat." And they just wandered away looking even more bewildered than when they asked me in the first place. But I think my sense is that storytelling is hugely, hugely important, because in the end, we are a narrative species. Robert, I've known you for 21 years. I don't actually know how old you are. I don't know how much you weigh.
71.
Okay, well, 1 year older than me. I don't know how many calories you have for breakfast. I know I've met your fabulous wife. I've talked with you. We've worked on projects together. We've told each other stories. And I think the heart of what we're doing here is creating a cadre of narrative that says, it could be different and it could still work. So anybody who can contribute to that with stories of what works, introducing us to groups, raising these issues within your own faith communities or with friends or family who are active in faiths, we need to create a wider sense that the most logical question in the world after, so what are you doing as a faith on the environment and sustainability is, and how is that reflected in where you're invested and how you use your assets?
Brilliant. I'm very sensitive. I promise you that we would keep it to 60 minutes because you've got a lot of things to do. You've got trillions to move. Sure. So what I'll do is for those who want to watch the replay, we will send the link and probably it takes a couple of hours to process the video. I'll send you a copy, and I'll also send you a list of, if we weren't able to get to all of the questions, I'll send you the chat area so you can address that later. I'd like to take a quick group selfie.
Just to say, I've got a little more time if people are willing to stay on.
Okay.
Stay on.
Right. I'll take this question. Anitra wanted to know, there's a series of empty church schools in South Africa and Africa, which are in important rural areas. They should be made into transformational schools with a brilliant new educational techniques to create employable, skilled youth from the poorest of poor groups. Do you have thoughts on how to make this concept move forward? Anitra, they're working with Ramfiela and John Gilmore at the Leap Schools in South Africa.
Yeah, really, really good question. And I mean, this cuts to the quick. It's 60. We did a survey with UNICEF about 7 years ago because they were not working with faith schools. Their WASH program was not extended to faith schools. And we said, but this is ridiculous. 50% of the world's schools are faith. They went, oh, no, rubbish. So they did a survey. It's 64% of schools in sub-Saharan Africa are faith-based. And very often they are faith-based because the government has ceased to function or has lost the finances that were so much hoped for at independence, when many of the faiths, Christian, Muslim, and Hindu, kind of gave their schools into the new country. I think, Anitra, one way forward is simply to go and actually talk to the diocese, or it probably is a diocese. If it's Muslim, it'll be slightly more complicated. Because it'll come under a particular confederation of mosques, and just say how important this work is. Ask them what you can do to encourage and support the government fund. There are groups like LM International, based in Sweden, who are there to help rebuild and restore faith-owned properties that play a role in education and health. But more importantly, it would be to raise it directly with the finance committee and whoever is in charge of that. In most cases, you will find, particularly in South Africa, there is an incredibly active Pippa, can you put a message up of what it is, whether it's SACRI or SAFRI? There is the Southern Africa Council on Environment and Religion. It's incredibly active. Talk to them. Look at the link that is possible there, and I think begin to, if you're finding resistance, well, how would this work? Let us know, and we can then put you in touch with people who have already done this. I think that's the main thing we can do. But you will find there's a lot of friends, but nobody will have ever sat down and said, this is a major asset, a major resource, a major investment in these communities. How can we best capitalize and emotionalize it? I'll be blunt.
Okay. And Thomas wanted to know, what is the best way to reach out to you or FaithInvest? I mean, I can give them the link to your website when we send out the replay. Is there anyone in particular that people should contact?
The easiest thing is to send it through to me. I have a very good team who are going to go through all the emails and we parcel them up to key people within the network. And if it's particularly interesting, I'll reply, because I'm fascinated by hearing what people are doing. And Thomas, nice to see you. I think bear in mind, we do not manage funds. We are staunchly against the promotion of a product, but we are deeply interested in those who are tackling the issues that we are all concerned with in a diversity of ways, and who want to look for allies, not just customers.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to do a quick group selfie to prove that we were actually working today. Just wave to the camera, and the system will collect all of the different selfies, and then I'll send everyone a card or an attachment with the various photos. So just wave. And Martin, you were absolutely brilliant. We're going to go into a group mixer for about 4 rounds. I want to thank Martin for doing a brilliant job, and also for the great work that he's doing. We need to thank also Sam, our producer, crypto genius and ramen critic, Ricky, my absolute better half with no filter, Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity, Vladimir Putin, our head of conflict resolution, Marjorie Taylor Greene, our Nobel Prize winner for stupidity, Elon Musk, our humility coach, and Donald Trump, our prison inmate fashion advisor. So thank you all for making this a great session, and thank you all for coming. And just stick around, and we'll go right into the mixer, and the system will connect you for a 5-minute video chat with someone in there. So I'll just stop this. And Martin, thank you again for taking the time. I really appreciate this. Let's stop that. Okay, we're going to go right into the mixer. So stick around and enjoy.